Welcome to DevTool Times. So awesome to have you here. So today we have a really special guest, Michael Stapelberg, but we will be waiting just a few minutes to let people stream in. Who is already there? Let's see. Ooh, we already have a few viewers. That's awesome. And just as a reminder, if you want to receive some notification about our every 2 weeks we do DevTool Time. So if you need a notification just to get a reminder to join us, then feel free to sign up here. And oops, I forgot to turn off this. This is a secret. There you go. Ha, see, that's why we need these beginning sessions. Okay, so yeah, sign up here at SourceGraph DevTool Time. And also you can add us directly to your calendar. That's the easiest way to get your notification. And of course, always tweet about us so that we can spread the love of DevTool Time. So cool. Ooh, let's see. People are already saying, hey, hi, Kelly. Kelly's here and Samson. Very nice, very nice. Thank you for joining.
Hello, Kelly.
I think
representing
we can
my
almost
team.
Start now. Yeah. Go batch changes.
Nice.
Awesome. Okay, let's start. I think we're good now. So, hi everyone. Welcome to DevTool Times. I'm super excited about our guest today, Michael Stapelberg. But first, let me tell you about DevTool Time. DevTool Time is a bi-monthly web series that we organize so that we can invite amazing developers and showcase their cool dev environment, their favorite dev tools, their productivity hacks. And in this case, we have a really special episode where we'll have a guest who's going to showcase also the open source tools that he himself created. So it's really exciting. And my co-host is Torsten Ball. He is a software engineer at SourceGraph. He's part of the batch changes team. Hi, Torsten.
Hello. And let me turn this around. Also welcome you, Vanessa, our community advocate here at SourceGraph, who is doing all the hard lifting for this web series behind the scenes and in front of the scenes. So happy to join you live here and also to talk to Michael about his amazing setup.
Yeah, if you haven't heard of Michael Stapelberg, you should, because he has done some really cool things for the open source community. He is the creator of Gokrazy. So if you have a Raspberry Pi and you don't use Gokrazy, think again. And then he's also done cool things with the i3, and you might also know him from the search engine Debian Code Search and a bunch of other open source tools. So yeah, hi, Michael. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here. It's always cool to share your tools and learn about other people's tools. You know, we could do this for hours.
Exactly. We're super excited. Shall we start off with your desk setup?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so what you can see here is a photo from last year, actually, but not much has changed. Mostly what I want to focus on are the peripherals, right? Because it's important what your computer has in terms of compute power, etc. But really, your computing experience is defined by the peripherals, right? So that's where I'm spending a lot of attention and time on. So let's start with the monitor. What you can see here is like one ginormous 32-inch monitor. It actually has an 8K resolution, so I'm definitely an outlier in that regard. But what I really like about it is that it has a lot of screen real estate, while at the same time, all of the fonts are super sharp. Like, it's really a pleasure to look at it. And when I'm looking at my computer for many, many, many hours every day, it's really well worth the investment.
Totally. Talk about pristine view.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so then moving down, you can see that I'm using a trackball mouse for ergonomics. And then you can see this crazy keyboard that I have here, which is an ergonomic keyboard. Specifically, the company that makes it is called Kinesis, and this model is the Advantage keyboard. I got into these keyboards well over 10 years ago, and I wouldn't want to type on anything else at this point. It's gotten so bad, like even when I'm traveling, going on vacation, I'm taking this keyboard with me, reserving some space in my luggage for it. This particular one is actually unique, right? So this is not just any Kinesis Advantage keyboard. I like the blue Cherry MX key switches more than others. The default key switches that this one comes with used to be the browns. Now they also have an option for red, but they didn't have an option for blues. So I contacted them back then, and they were like, well, we can't give you a keyboard that has the blues, but we can send you like all the PCBs, and then you can just solder it yourself if that's your thing. And I was like, yes, please, yes. And that's kind of how I got hooked into the whole keyboard hacking thing, right?
So you basically created your own keyboard. Like, this is
exactly.
just a shell case.
Yes. So this keyboard is entirely unique. So it's not just the key switches, also the keyboard controller that I'm running. I built it myself because the original firmware had a bug on it, and they couldn't fix it even after a couple of tries. So I built my own, and now I'm running open source software even on my keyboard. It's very exciting.
Whoa,
I feel like
that's awesome.
In a couple of years, there will be a Michael Stapelberg signature model of this. It sounds like, with guitars where you have these pros and they have the custom ones, or with cars or something. So I'm looking forward to this.
Exactly.
Nice.
At some point, you'll just be able to buy all of my gear.
Nice. Like Beyonce says he'd buy it.
You had a question.
I can recommend it.
What was the model of your monitor?
Yeah, so only Dell is the only company right now that makes an 8K monitor. The model is actually, let me pull this up. I have this blog post here where you can see the exact model. It's the UP3218K. It's 32 inches. I don't know what the 1 is for. And then the 8K is the resolution. It's kind of how I keep it in my head.
Nice. Wow. Someone's asking also... Sorry, someone's asking, since we're talking about the monitor, what your favorite font is to have it extra crispy on your monitor.
Right. And at that point, we can probably just switch straight into an Emacs window so you can actually see what this looks like. So this font here is called the Go font. This is a font that was commissioned by the creators of the Go programming language because they didn't have a font to include with the Go language. So they made one, and I think it actually looks quite nice. So at some point, I just switched my browser and my editors to use the Go font, and I just never saw a need to switch back. I like it.
Nice.
I like that even the font is something special. From the custom keyboard to I use this boutique font. Nice.
Cool. So yeah, let's just go right into the Gokrazy then. Let's go crazy with Gokrazy.
Absolutely. Let me just pull up the website real quick. So Gokrazy, as you mentioned earlier, Vanessa, it's for Raspberry Pis, right? So I found myself at some point running all of these Raspberry Pis, but then I realized, wait, I hadn't actually updated these in quite a while, right? I think it was 2017, and I was still running a Raspberry Pi installed in 2013. I was like, wow, that thing must have dozens of security vulnerabilities, and I really just can't find the time to update any of it, right? So I was thinking about this, and I was like, what can we do about it, right? Because you have, if you think about it, you have a Go program and you have a Raspberry Pi, and then you need to install a Linux distribution on your Raspberry Pi in order to use it, right? You could install Raspbian, or I don't know if you're into Arch or Fedora or what have you, right? You can install any of these, but they're all fairly heavyweight, and then you need to update them, of course. So what can we do to make it easier? And Gokrazy is the result of that exploration, right? It's the applications that you want to deploy. So in my case, it's like home automation stuff that I want to run on my Raspberry Pis. And then there's only 4 moving parts that are added to the mix, right? You obviously need a kernel. So we use the Linux kernel, but we don't use the Raspbian version or anything. We use really the upstream Linux kernel. And that way we can pull in all of these security fixes very quickly. Then you need the Raspberry Pi firmware files to boot it up. You need the Go compiler and standard library, of course, to build your Go programs for the Raspberry Pi. And then we're adding just a few small programs to take care of, for example, clock synchronization and network configuration. But then the rest is really just your programs, right? So that's what the idea is. And to give you an idea of how it works, we have this tool called the Gokrazy Packer. You install it, and then you just tell it to overwrite the SD card for your Raspberry Pi and put on it these Go packages, right? then you see an output like this, and your Raspberry Pi comes up, and it's now fully managed and fully Go only, except for the Linux kernel, of course. And next time you want to update it, you just change the override and change it into -update, and then it will update it over the network. And I just have like a daily cron job, which in the morning updates all of my Raspberry Pis, and that's how I keep them up to date now.
Nice.
Easy peasy.
As somebody who set up 3 Raspberry Pis in the past, I don't know, 6 weeks in my home, and already feeling anxious about updating them. And one of them is running only a single Go, 50 lines of whatever Go. This
perfect target for Gokrazy. You should definitely try it out. Yeah.
Yes, this makes me sleep better at night.
So talking about how many Raspberry Pis you have, check out this picture of an IKEA pegboard, right? Into which I've added a bunch of Raspberry Pis. So this is the continuous integration setup that I'm using for the Gokrazy project. It's also where I run some of my Raspberry Pis. So not all of them are continuous integration. But conceptually what happens is if we go to github/gokrazy/kernel, you can see the repository into which new Linux kernel versions are imported. And you can see the current one is Linux 5.13, which was released last week. And it was integrated right away the same day. And you can see that all of this works just like a human would do it. So we have all of these pull requests that update to a newer version. And you can see that what they change is just the source from which to pull the Linux kernel, and then the automation takes care of the rest. So when this pull request comes in, what one of these Raspberry Pis will do is it will build like the new image, including the new kernel. It will install it on one of the other Raspberry Pis. It will reboot it and then verify via the serial console that I have attached here with like a USB to serial adapter that it comes back up, it boots correctly, it finds network interface. And that's when the automation says, okay, go. Now let's merge this new kernel into our repository.
This is a genius hack. I love that you're using an IKEA pegboard for this. And look at the zip ties. It's just held up by zip ties.
So exactly.
We're standing
nice
here.
Airy.
We're standing right in front of the rabbit hole. So I don't want to jump in, but serial console, just, I don't know, 30-second explanation. I'm interested.
Oh, right. So it's essentially like a text output, right? Like if you don't have a monitor attached to these, how are you going to look at whether the Linux kernel comes up? Well, you connect a serial console to it, and then you get, instead of the monitor showing you the log messages, you get the log messages over this little serial interface.
Nice. So like in the proper, server rack. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah, exactly. That's where you would be familiar with the serial consoles. Yeah.
Cool.
Right. And then let's actually jump into how I would work on Gokrazy, right? So I typically organize my work with different workspaces, right? And if I hold the modifier key, you can see it in the bottom left of my screen share that I now have currently 3 workspaces, right? I have the first one on which we had the browser. That's what we've been looking at so far. I have the second one in which I'm now starting to work on Gokrazy. And then I have another one on which I'm running the screen key program for this particular presentation.
And
now,
taking a step back, what we see, don't see is I3, the window manager that you helped created and helped develop with others, right?
Exactly. So some people, when I first share my screen, some people are like, "What? Are you working in like text mode? Like, why is it not graphical?" Right?
Yeah.
And for the answer to that question, like originally when I had one of my friends from university, he asked me this. I was like, "No, of course it's graphical. See, you can open more windows." And he was like, "Wow, that makes me more confused than before." So that's why now I know to start something graphical like GIMP, right? So that people know that oh yeah, this is just, it looks different, but it's still all of the programs that Linux has, right?
Yeah.
So what's a window manager? Well, in Linux, you have an additional layer, between your operating system and your keyboard shortcuts for switching between windows and stuff like that. And the actual thing that makes it all happen, right? In the Linux architecture, there's one component that you can actually exchange, and that's the window manager. So the manager is responsible for placing new windows. In my case, you can see that the full screen is in use for all of these windows, right? And nothing is overlapping. And that's why i3 is called a tiling window manager, because it arranges the windows like tiles on your monitor. So i3 in particular is not just any window manager. Okay, I got this. So this is the website, right?
Have fans in the audience.
Oh, great.
Even saying that that's the main reason they use Linux.
Oh, yeah, it definitely locks you in. I'm sorry about that. Right, so i3 is a tiling window manager, as I said, and it is primarily targeted at advanced users and developers. So this means that there is a certain learning curve to it, right? Whereas other window managers are trying to be intuitive, discoverable, and easy to approach for novice users. In this particular case, we thought, well, okay, so these other window managers are taking care of the novice users. Now, if we had to design one, but for advanced users, how would it look like? And what could we do if we let people learn first and use later? And i3 is kind of the result of it, right? And one particular thing about i3 is the documentation is really good. I can show you the user's guide. This is what you should start with. But another interesting thing might be the reference card, because when you see me using my computer, I'm always only using these keyboard shortcuts, right? And I can enable screen keys so you can see what I'm pressing. So in this case, to switch between workspaces, I have the super key and 1 or 2 or 3, etc. So that's for switching between the workspaces. And then I have N, D, T, and R for the navigation in each of these directions, right? You could also use the arrow keys, but I like these keys more because they are where I'm placing my fingers on the keyboard when I'm resting my hand there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's a side note again. I'm sorry, but you don't use H, J, K, and L like Vim. You use J, right? Because your index fingers already. You start with J, K, L, and then semicolon. Because
yeah, that is exactly right.
Yeah.
And we show it in the user's guide too. So this is the default configuration here. And you can see that H is just shifted by 1 here, right? So that is a common stumbling block for people who are too used to Vim. Because actually the Vim thing it's not on the home row precisely, even though many people say that, because it's shifted left by 1. So i3 really is on the home row. But I can understand that some people might want to change it back to Vim.
Oh, but Beiyang is saying weird stuff in chat.
They should just stop using them. Yeah, should come to Emacs.
Never. Yeah. There was another really interesting question. What is this one? What's the origin of the name i3?
The origin of the name i3. So i3 is the spiritual successor to WMII. And WMII is the successor to WMI. So the WMI stood for Window Manager Improved. The II was Window Manager Improved. So we were like, well, ours is improved. It's i3, right?
Nice.
How old is i3? It feels to me like I've been using this a decade ago.
Yeah.
Possible?
You would have been one of the early people then. It was started in 2009. February 2009. Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
An oldie that has stayed evergreen.
Absolutely.
You mentioned that, or here's my take on it. So, sorry, but my take is that you focus on advanced users and people who want the software to get out of the way as much as possible, which means you don't have a menu and you lose on discoverability. You cannot afford to show tooltips and whatnot. But instead, you do this. You made this decision to say, yep, like the software itself might not be discoverable, but our docs will be even better. And then we put the learning curve in the docs. That means we make this approachable. So, and a big part of the docs and how you use i3 is also how you configure it. And you mentioned earlier before this live stream that you put a lot of thought into how to, how the configuration file works.
Absolutely, yeah. I like to think of, when people think about the user interface of something, they typically think about the aspects that you interact with, like a button or something, right? In the case of i3, they might be thinking, oh yeah, there's like the workspace bar on the bottom of your screen, or there's these window titles. They're very minimalistic, right? But it's still like that's what people think of immediately when they hear user interface. But really, I want to state that for programs, the user interface is much, much larger, right? Even for programs such as i3, you still have, for example, the config file, as you mentioned, which is something that users will sooner or later interact with. And you'll also have log messages and error messages and such, right? So it really pays off to make all of this approachable. For the error messages, just think about what a user who doesn't know what this is all about might wonder, right? Like, put a common thing, a common misconfiguration, explain to people why is that, right? So for example, if you run i3 dump log, which is a helper tool that gives you a debug log file of your current i3 session, right? And if you run this and you run it from a different computer because maybe your screen froze, your computer is hung, right? So you grab your laptop, you log into your other computer and you're like i3 dump log, right? You enter it and it doesn't work. Why does it not work? Well, because the display environment variable is not set, because you're logging in via SSH, not from a graphical session. So it can't talk to the i3 instance. And we actually went the extra mile and we added code so that it would check, is the display environment variable set? And if no, it suggests you how you could set it, right? And in various places of the code, we have these extra steps where we try to come up with a really good, really precise error message, because we know that's what people will interact with, right? And for the config file specifically, one thing that we did to ensure that it would be a good surface for people is, this was, i3 was started during my university days. So what we did here in the old version of i3, we had a config file that was too minimalistic. It was, we started with the Vim philosophy of, just having single keys and make everything like short and brief and, But we found later on that it's actually more important for a config file to be descriptive. So that wasn't a good choice to begin with. But then when we redesigned the config file with the new version, the major version 4 of i3, what we did was we came up with a design sketch. We took the default config file, we removed all of the comments, and then I gave it to another student colleague of mine who had not used Linux at all at that point. Right? I told him, now you explain to me what this file does, right? And I was just listening to him, and as he told me different things, I was like, oh yeah, this one he understood perfectly. This one needs more explanation. This one could benefit from a comment. This one we should probably call differently, right? So in a way, that was like one of the few user studies maybe done at that point in the space of tiling window managers. But I would say it has definitely paid off. Like the config file is something that people quite like in comparison to other window managers.
Yeah,
nice. That shows dedication.
Yeah, what you just described should be the definition of user-friendly, because it is inherently user-friendly what you do. Like, you do this out of kindness and empathy with the user, and yet, often what's considered user-friendly gets in the way of the user or tries to hide stuff behind advanced menus and stuff. So I don't know, I love
exactly.
This philosophy.
There's also the saying that Unix is user-friendly. It's just very picky about who its friends are.
Yeah.
So we're kind of like that, right? Like, if you belong to our niche of people who want to learn about a window manager that's exclusively done via keyboard shortcuts and such, we might as well be friendly once you jump past that hurdle, right?
Yeah, true. That's cool.
Nice. Well, how about we go into some other cool tools that you might have not contributed to, but you love.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So, we were talking about how would I actually start working on one of my projects, right? And, for i3, we mentioned earlier, there's no menus or anything. It's possible, however, to configure a menu. I'm just not the person for it, right? Like in the default config, there's even like a program launcher with which you can start. For example, GIMP, I could have started it from the launcher, but I prefer to start out in the terminal and then work my way from there. So in this case, the first step is open a new terminal emulator window and then change into the Gokrazy directory. And right off the bat here, you can see that I have this weird alias here, which is ~sign Gokrazy. And you can see that if I switch one directory up, my prompt also changes, right? And if I switch back into the Gokrazy directory, it changes back. So this is a feature of Z shell, which is called hashes. So you can give special directories that you're typically working in shorter names, right? And I use this for all of the projects that I'm currently involved in, so that I can quickly change my way around and switch between directories. But then, once I'm in the correct directory, sometimes I would just look around. I have these shortcuts. All of my shortcuts are a single letter. From the old days, I have V for Vim, and I have capital V for Vim, but as sudo. Right.
Oh.
These days, however, I use Emacs more. So of course I have E for Emacs, and that's how I would typically start into Emacs.
Yeah,
all right.
Asking if you write your scripts, and there's two.
All right. Do I use the Z shell for scripts? So philosophically, I'm opposed to shell scripts. Because typically I find that people start them and then they grow and then they become super unmaintainable and they have really, really hard gotchas in them. So in a professional context, I like to avoid shell scripts whenever I can. Like, my position is literally anything is better than a shell script. But when I do need to write a shell script, I would write it in Bash. Just for the reason that typically these scripts are then for sharing with other people. And then I don't want them to have to install Z shell or learn or debug Z shell or just deal with it, right? So for portability, I would go with Bash, but really my advice is don't write shell scripts, use like a higher level language.
Philosophically, I'm opposed to shell scripts. We should save this somewhere. I'm going to print it out and put it on a wall with your name.
Please do. I would. That would be my lasting impact on the world. Fewer shell scripts.
Cool.
Right.
So,
okay.
Emacs.
Quote of the day.
Emacs. Right. Okay. So people are like Emacs versus Vim. It's this never-ending story. As I alluded to, I had used Vim. Like, that was what I started with when I first got into computers. But at some point later, I was trying out different Emacs-based things, right? There's like the not much email client, which I don't use anymore, but it was what got me into Emacs. And then there's other things which are like the distinguishing feature of Emacs is that it's such a good platform to have these really powerful plugins. And one of them is Maggot. So inevitably, whenever I work on open source projects, of course, it's all Git-based these days, and Maggot really is my favorite interface to using Git. Independent of whatever editor you might be using for your day-to-day editing, I have some friends who exclusively start Emacs for Maggot, but still use Vim for editing. So that's how good it is. It will even get your Vim friends to use Emacs for their version control needs. Right. Okay, so we can still see some changes that I had left in over here from the previous iteration that we did this. One thing that I can quickly show here is that all of the changes are very interactive and discoverable in Maggot. So for example, if I say, oh yeah, I want to just remove this change, what I can use is K in order to discard this region, right? You can see that I selected a particular line and then only this line would be discarded. Now I press Y and the change is gone, right? Yeah. If I forgot what the key is for this, I can just press question mark and it comes up with this helpful pop-up and it has all of the keys in there. And then from here, I can kind of make my way through it, right? So for example, if I say, oh yeah, I'm in the master branch right now, how about I switch to a different branch for the feature that I'm about to implement? So I look for branch, okay, that's B. And then it tells me, okay, for branching, you have the following options, right? I could use a new branch entirely, or I press S for a new spin-off branch off of the master. I call it feature live stream. There we go. I'm now in a new branch, right? Or I could say, well, actually, I'm going to deal with this later, right? I'm just going to switch back to master, bam, and now I'm back to master, right? It's as quick as this. And as you get into Maggot, you'll realize you're just pressing a couple of keys very quickly after each other, and it's just so much more effective than the Git command line tool to work with your repository.
Let me ask you a philosophically loaded question, because you said you always start from the shell, and yeah. I also do, and I consider the shell or Unix my IDE, and everything happens in a shell. So when I tried Emacs, I felt like this kind of clashes with the Emacs ethos of everything is in Emacs. Like Emacs people love to pull everything into Emacs because that makes it more powerful. And you're using now Git in Emacs, and yes, like you're just showing you can use a shell in Emacs, and that gives you superpowers, right? You can now get the output of the shell into your other buffers. Where do you draw the line? Like what do you do in Emacs, and what do you do on the shell?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I sometimes go back and forth between them. One advantage, as you mentioned, of the built-in Emacs shell is that you can copy the output, you can modify the output, etc. For that sort of thing, it's really, really cool. And you start to wonder, well, why don't terminal emulators offer you to copy the output and modify it? But it turns out some of them actually do. I think in macOS there was a feature that was added at some point. But to circle back to your question, you can see that, well, now the shell is an Emacs buffer, right? But as you might imagine, I'm familiar with the window manager, right? So sometimes I want things as windows. So that's why sometimes I have a separate terminal emulator as a window, and that just kind of helps me organize things, right? Like I try to keep my Emacs usage to editing and managing Git repositories and such, and I try to keep the rest separate. It's also, unfortunately, the case that while Emacs is very powerful, it's not necessarily the quickest. You can make it quick in terms of startup, etc. It's not a problem. But if you have like shell output and you have many, many thousands of long lines scrolling through, etc., your terminal emulator in a dedicated program and window will be more optimized for this in comparison to Emacs. So I found that for my low latency preferences of everything on my computer, it's just better to use a full-blown terminal. Also imagine that interactive programs that use, for example, a cursor-based text UI cannot be used in eShell, right? So if I want to use like top in order to see my processes on this machine, I can't do it in eShell. So there are some limitations to it, but it is an interesting thing to play around with for sure.
Yeah, and I saw that when you start Emacs, the language server was booting up, and that means, well, what I'm getting is you do all of your development inside Emacs, like compiling stuff and fixing errors and linting and whatnot.
Exactly. Yeah. That was the one thing that I think I would recommend to everybody, and that was what I was trying to get at. Is like independent of whether you use Vim or you use Emacs or you use VS Code or you use something else, I would recommend you grab an editor that has language server support. Right. For people who are not familiar, language server is a protocol which is spoken between the integration programs for the individual programming languages. So there's like a Go language server, there's a Python language server, there's a C++ language server, and your editor. So now all of these editors can understand what the programming languages can do and can integrate with them much better. So for example, you can see here on the screen on the bottom left, you see, well, the new config socket signature of the function is shown to me because that's where my cursor is, right? And I can also press, actually, let me show you this. So meta and dot is to go into a definition, and meta and comma is to jump back out. So I will very frequently like jump through the code like this and then navigate between different windows and different call stacks and stuff like that. And I would go as far as saying that without LSP, it's entirely a waste of time to navigate large code bases that you're not familiar with. So for me, like before I pick up work on any open source project, be it like the firmware for my keyboard, which actually has multiple Git submodules, etc., but is written in C, it's an embedded system. Or if I'm working on like higher level Go stuff or i3 itself, which is also written in C, for all of these, like the prerequisite always is get that language server working, right? Because it saves so much time in the long run. So even, as I did, like I have a blog post on this where I show how to set up Eclipse of all things with language server support for the QMK keyboard firmware. And it took me many, many, many hours, but bottom line, it was still faster than to not use like all of these jumping and integration techniques because they're just so worth it.
And how is the language server support in Emacs? Because I think older editors have kind of struggled to jump on that train. Like Vim had it took a while to catch up, and now with new Vim, they fully adopted it. part, and thanks to TJ, who also said in chat, an alternative to using language server in Emacs is to write language server support for your own editor, which is what he did. So how do you rate language server support in Emacs?
I would say it's pretty good. Even before language server support caught up in Vim, I think it was in a pretty good state. There are multiple major contenders. I would say, unfortunately, though, they're each playing to different strengths. So there's the LSP mode plugin, and then there's a different one, which is called Egglot. And I'm using Egglot because it has the philosophy of getting out of your way, whereas LSP mode is like all of the bells and whistles are enabled, right? So, for people who are like, when they open a file and then they see like, all of the squiggly lines and warnings and this thing is deprecated and the compiler is starting and they're like, oh my God, leave me alone, just don't do anything. For them, I think Egglot is a much better alternative because, what I'm showing here is like the default setup, right? So if I click on an identifier, it shows the documentation. You can even turn this off, right? And then it becomes much more unobtrusive. But like, the standard things such as, quick fix suggestions, that's all supported. And in general, I don't see issues, specific to Egglot or anything like that. So I've been using it for many years and it's fine, at least for what I'm doing with it.
So no memory issues. Nice.
Memory issues. No, I have not run into memory issues running language servers locally, but I do also have to admit that in this computer, I have 64 gigs of memory, and I tend to just max this out. So it's just not a concern for me typically. Yeah.
Nice.
Nice.
Cool.
Very cool. I think we're through with everything, right? Did we check everything off?
Yeah. So, now might be a time for any last questions.
Yeah,
anybody might be having.
Let me see. Oh.
You can even open 5 Chrome tabs with that much RAM. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Actually, I have many, many different Chrome windows and many tabs open. It's not a problem. But maybe the Chrome came first and me buying a lot of memory came later.
I have a last question.
Yeah.
Since you thought so much about your setup, I'm sure you have an answer for this. If you could snap your finger, like how would you improve your development experience or your setup? No programming needed, no tools to invent. Magic wand, what would you create?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it depends a little bit on the setup that I'm in, right? So I tend to use this setup, like, Linux running i3 using Emacs, etc., in a variety of different contexts, right? Mm-hmm. Both for, just my private computing needs, if I'm, say, writing a text document or something like that. Also for open source development, also for work, also for like volunteering, etc., etc. And it's not so much a comment on this particular environment because I think it's very flexible. It's more a comment on the things that I'm interacting with. And if I could magically snap my fingers like that, I would just wish that everything was a lot faster, right? Because frankly, like many of the tools, they take too long to start up. When you exit them, they take a long time too. Like, what are they even doing? And then, I just come across so many things that are not as optimized as they could be. And I don't mean like in a micro benchmark shave of a couple milliseconds thing, but I mean in like why am I sitting in front of my computer waiting for multiple seconds, right? Like I'm losing my focus, losing my attention. Yeah. Why is our world like that? Like, right?
Yeah.
So that would be my magic wand.
And now I wish that a genie grants you your wish and you can make everything faster.
Need for speed.
Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience as well, asking for suggestions regarding Emacs.
Yeah. Okay. So this question is like a Vim user who is thinking about trying out Emacs. Very good. But found Spacemacs and Doom Emacs. What would I suggest? So Spacemacs and Doom Emacs both are, you could say, customizations or distributions or derivations of Emacs, right? It's like you install Emacs and it's pre-configured. And these are pretty fancy. So if you're the kind of person who would be interested in, for example, in using Visual Studio Code or other kind of environments that just come and they're ready to go in like their default settings and they do all of the fancy bells and whistles right out of the bat, then I would say definitely try out either one. Spacemacs and Doom Emacs both are pretty good. However, they're also pretty heavyweight, right? In terms of what they come with. So it might be that they start up a little bit slower than you'd like, and then it can be hard as a beginner to understand what's really happening. So the other school of thought, different or contrasting the everything should be set up by default school of thought is I want to like build my thing up from scratch, right? And it's the same regardless of whether you use Vim or you use Emacs. But there is something to starting with an almost empty config file and then just adding stuff that you like over the years. It gives you very tight control over how your editor behaves. But I understand that it's not for everybody, right? Not everybody wants to start from scratch and look at what other people are doing. But that is certainly how I've done it. And for the same reason, I've also decided not to use evil mode in Emacs, which is the mode that gives you VI key bindings and the look and feel, because I really wanted to learn the real thing, right? And I actually think that I have benefited from it because previously I also had my shell configured to use the Vim key bindings and stuff, but I found that it gives me a much more, I want to say, Linuxy experience if I just use like the defaults, which is Emacs-like key bindings, because suddenly, Control A for beginning of the line and Control E for end of the line works in all of the programs, right? I want to say Linux how it's meant to be used, right? And you see all of these little things, right? For example, you start Emacs and then you're like, well, I'm about to debug something. GDB, the GNU debugger, is a GNU project. Emacs is a GNU project. There's probably something there, right? And then you look into it and you find out, yeah, there's actually an amazing integration for GDB into Emacs, and it works much, much better than all of the other GDB frontends. And I had just never used it because I hadn't used Emacs before, right? Or for example, if you run a compilation and you type in make, etc., and configure, make install, the typical 3-step installation thing. And I did this in my Emacs, where I would typically say meta-x compile, and then it suggests make. If you put in configure and you run it in Emacs, the output is colored, and it's not colored on your terminal, but it is in Emacs. So there's like these little integrations and things that you just miss out on if you don't give like the original thing a try, right? So I really did spend a conscious amount of time and effort on learning like the default vanilla key bindings, and getting into the Emacs spirit, so to say, and the Emacs world. And I think I'm better off for it. So that's what I would personally recommend. But your choice might be different, and that's totally okay.
That's a fantastic answer. Like I love how much thought you put into this. Even though I'm fairly reading through the comments, I can see there's different camps still, and I think I'm in the other camp. Let's see.
Nice. Well,
cool.
Thank you again. If there aren't any other questions, what's this?
This is the last question.
Yeah.
The last one.
Last one.
Okay, so we have a DWM user. Is there anything besides the config file that you think i3 does better? So the big difference between DWM and i3 is going to be the layout approach, right? When you open a new window on your screen, DWM has these layouts in which your windows will be sorted into, whereas in i3, it's sort of a manual tiling approach where there's not, if we could go back to the screen share, maybe that would be easier, right? So if I start out on a new workspace, there's not going to be like, big window on the left and multiple small ones on the right. Instead, it just grows, right? And then I can say, oh yeah, I wanted to have this on the right, or I wanted to have multiple here, and then divide this up, or for example, resize this, etc. So you are in charge of your layout, and it's pretty quick to work with it in terms of keyboard shortcuts. And for example, the resizing I did with the mouse here, which tends to be quicker than keyboard resizing. So right tool for the right job is my approach here. That would be the biggest look and feel difference between the two window managers. And I think that really is what it comes down to, right? Like, how does it feel when you use it? So my general recommendation for people who are not sure whether i3 is for them, is watch the screencast, right? There's a 5-minute screencast that shows you the basic features, what we've talked about here, like what are the layouts, how do you focus and move between windows, between workspaces, etc. And then if you see this and afterwards you think, well, that could be interesting, just give it a shot, right? And if you see it and think it's not for me, that's fine, use something else.
Nice. I'm
Awesome.
going to give it a shot tomorrow. Like you convinced me. Seeing your setup makes me so inspired to just program for a bunch of hours. And if I'm weak tomorrow, I'll also order a new computer screen.
That is exactly what DevTool Time is for. Awesome. So yeah, if you haven't heard of Michael Stapelberg so far somehow, then you can definitely follow him on Twitter. Check him out, and you'll see even more of this wisdoms trickling in through Twitter. And yeah, again, tweet about us, about DevTool Time, so that more people can find out about all these cool things. Thank you, Michael, for giving us so much information. I found this live stream super educational. It was just like I learned so much. Thank you so much. And next time we will have Mitchell Hashimoto from HashiCorp, co-founder and CTO. So definitely check in. Torsten will be there. TJ will be there. Byung will be there. I won't. I'll be on vacation, but you should definitely be there. Cool. Then see you or come back to DevTool Time on July 21st. And thank you again, Michael. See you, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.